My question is to the Premier. Speaker, this morning our party and our leader, Patrick Brown, laid out our concerns with the Hydro One fire sale, a sale that the PCs knew was wrong in 2002, and we know it is wrong today. This morning you heard Patrick Brown talk about the first demonstration of hydro in 1910. The demonstration lit up a sign for all to see above a street in Kitchener, and that sign said, "For the people." Speaker, because of this government's mismanagement and its desire to sell Hydro One to pay its debts, the utility will no longer be for the people. Premier, will you stop the Hydro One fire sale and keep the majority of it for the people?
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me just say to the member opposite, and he can deliver the message to his leader, that the reason we are in the process of reviewing assets, Mr. Speaker, the reason we have made a decision about Hydro One, Mr. Speaker, is that we know that investing in transit and transportation infrastructure is critical to the economic life of this province, Mr. Speaker, and the opportunity to grow. I know that the interim leader of the opposition is not supportive of investing in transit, Mr. Speaker. They've made that very, very clear. But, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that we ran on a platform of economic growth and investment in this province, in people's talent and skills, in infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, and the infrastructure component, Mr. Speaker, was backed up by a review of assets. That's the investment that we committed to, and that's the investment we're making, Mr. Speaker.
Back to the Premier. Speaker, the misguided actions of the government means that Hydro One will no longer be for the people. Sadly, the sale isn't about the people. The sale isn't about infrastructure. There's nothing new in the government's recent budget about infrastructure that wasn't already laid out in last year's budget.
Order.
And it didn't include the sale of Hydro One at that time. The sale is about paying the government's debts. Debts they can't keep under control. The Premier and the Liberal Party are not looking out for the people's interests. Premier, if you were looking out for the people of Ontario, you'd allow the Auditor and the Financial Accountability Officer to review the sale to make sure that we're getting the best value for the people. Will you at least commit to that today?
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me just remind the member opposite, as I have said many times in this House, our plan to invest in infrastructure, whether it's roads, bridges, whether it's connecting links in communities around the province, or whether it's transit infrastructure, that plan always contained as part a review of our assets, Mr. Speaker, because we knew we were going to need that funding to be able to make those investments. Mr. Speaker, I will also remind the member opposite that as a backdrop to our decision around Hydro One, we used the sale of the 407, Mr. Speaker, as an example of how not to sell off an asset, Mr. Speaker, because the way the 407 was sold off, there was no ongoing return to the people of Ontario. There was no targeted investment in the future of the people of Ontario, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, there was no accurate assessment of the value of that asset before it was sold off. We are not doing what the opposite party did on the 407, Mr. Speaker. We're investing in the people of Ontario.
Final supplementary.
Be seated, please. Be seated.
Thank you. Well, Premier, how do we know that anything you just said is true?
We don't.
There'll be no accountability after the budget is passed this Wednesday. You're selling Hydro One to a shell company that won't be subject to oversight from the Auditor General, Freedom of Information, Financial Accountability Officer, none of the officers of this House, the Ombudsman. You're telling us to believe that the $15 billion total value is the true value of Hydro One, yet there's no independent studies, there's no cost-benefit analysis, there's nobody but you and your hired hack that tells us that we're to take your word for it. You've already spent the $4 billion you're going to get in terms of $2 billion for smart meters, 1.1 to cancel gas plants.
Question.
83 million we just learned in terms of the Hydro One billing scandal. Premier, why should we believe anything you say?
We shouldn't. Thank you. Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if you look around this province, you can see infrastructure projects being built around the province, Mr. Speaker. You can see shovels in the ground, and you can see projects being completed. So that, Mr. Speaker, is the experience that we are building on in our investments going forward. But I'd say to the member opposite, I don't know where this party's coming from, Mr. Speaker. The leader of the official opposition seems to be a little confused about where he stands. Patrick Brown, on May 5th of this year, said, I generally believe that the private sector can do a better job than the public sector. I generally think market conditions would be helpful for a lot of government agencies. That was Patrick Brown, May 5th, Mr. Speaker. In their most recent paper on energy, that was in 2012, Mr. Speaker, they suggested opening both Hydro One and OPG to investment, Mr. Speaker. So, what I would say is the member opposite. They don't support investing in transit and transportation infrastructure. We understand that. We do. We know that's necessary. We said all along that we needed to review assets. That's what we're doing.
Thank you. Your question, the member from Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke.
My question is to the Premier as well.